All right, welcome back, guys, for part 3, hopefully the last part of our review of Chapter 34. We're up to the point where Hitler is going to invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941. This is really, as an American, it's something we don't think about as often, but this really is going to be the deciding theater of World War II. The attack on the Soviet Union is going to unleash this absolutely colossal, titanic war between those two powers. It begins on June 22nd, 1941. Hitler calls this Operation Barbarossa, and his goal is to basically take the big cities like Leningrad and Moscow, and hopefully, he thinks, that the Soviets will basically just kind of collapse because of the leadership of Stalin had so weakened the country. That's the plan for Hitler. And the big question back here in America is, would we go so far as to extend Lend-Lease equipment and aid to Stalin? I mean, Stalin is an absolute monster. If you know anything about world history, this guy is responsible for tens of millions of deaths, probably more than even Hitler himself. So would we give him stuff? Well, even Churchill was sympathetic to the idea of giving Stalin at least something. He famously said before about Stalin that if Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil and the House of Commons. So it really comes down to the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And now all of a sudden it's us and the Brits and the Soviets in this. So we are going to extend the stuff that Stalin needs. We're going to give him weapons and money to the tune of $11 billion to the Soviet Union. Well, before we get America into this war directly, as far as officially, we need to talk about something called the Atlantic Conference. And to understand the Atlantic Conference, we need to go back and look at Wilson's World War I peace plan once again, the 14 points it was known as. And the 14 points had kind of been this grand vision for what post-World War I would look like, the world, rather, would look like after World War I, a world that was safer and freer. And so in August 1941, again, this is just a couple months before Pearl Harbor, FDR meets with Churchill. Now, this was all secret at first, anyways. The public was not told this meeting was going to happen. Rather, they were told that FDR is going to go on a vacation for about a week at sea. And he does go to sea, and he sees at sea, thank you, Churchill. Sees him off the coast of Newfoundland, which is up there in Canada, and they're there to discuss things we have in common. And they come up with the Atlantic Charter, an agreement, an 8-point outline agreement to make the world simply a safer, better place once the war is over. So we're not even in this war yet, but we're already thinking about how the post-war world's going to look like and operate. Now, we're not going to go through all 8 points. The one I want to focus on is just, I think, the longest lasting, the greatest legacy of those points. This is the idea of some sort of replacement for the League of Nations, a permanent system of general security. This is obviously a reference to what's going to evolve into the United Nations. And the League of Nations had to be replaced. It just had not done what it was supposed to do. It was not keeping up with the design of protecting the world from another world war. So now we're going to get back into the Atlantic Ocean and focus on our sort of ongoing unofficial war with the Germans. And of course, why the Germans are using their U-boats or submarines is to stop our ships with all the goods on them getting to the British. In July of 1941, FDR orders our warships to escort these convoys as far as Iceland. So we're going to go about halfway across the Atlantic. And obviously, if the Germans want to sink the ships, they're going to have to go through our warships first, which means, well, we're going to see some actual bloodshed. September 1st, 1941. This is the first real act of aggression, I guess we might say, where one of our ships was in fact attacked by a German U-boat, the USS Kearny. It was not damaged, no one died, but FDR felt moved to issue what he called a shoot-on-sight order. So if you see the U-boat, you don't wait to be attacked, you attack it first. On October 17th, 1941, another one of our warships called the USS Kearny was attacked. 11 Americans were killed in this attack. And then on the 31st of October, the Reuben James was sunk and over 100 Americans died. And, we have a situation in which Americans are dying in a war that's not officially on. This is pretty dramatic stuff. And so we are focused so heavily on the Atlantic. What I don't think we see coming is aggression from Asia. And we have to understand that the Japanese home islands are not very resource rich. They're frankly very resource poor. And this had motivated the Japanese to expand outward, to get their hands on more resource-rich areas. And they have a real problem. They're stuck in this long-term bloody war in China, one that they're winning, but it's one that, it's still messy and very costly. And they need to be able to import all kinds of materials from around the world, including from America, in particular, our oil. Japan doesn't have a lot of oil, so they need to import it. And so to put pressure on the Japanese to give up their aggressive ways, we decide to end oil shipments to Japan in the middle of 1941. This was in response, in particular, from the Japanese takeover of French Indochina, so modern-day Vietnam and their neighbors. Japan, when we cut them off, feel basically that a declaration of war has been issued against them, a war of economics anyways, where without those raw materials, Japan's war economy can't function. So they feel backed into a corner, feel like they have no choice but to retaliate. And so when we demand that Japan withdraws from China, Japan simply refuses. And the Japanese don't know, but we have cracked a lot of their military code. So we know an attack against us is likely. We just don't know the key questions of when and where. And this brings us to Pearl Harbor, which was not the place we're expecting the attack to take place. We expected the attack maybe to take place in the Philippines or some other place in the Pacific, but not necessarily Pearl Harbor. And the goal of Japan at Pearl Harbor is to destroy our Pacific fleet. If you take out our battleships, it'll take years for us to recover, and this would, in theory, give Japan the time they need to just kind of run wild across the Pacific and build a defensive network of islands that we would have to fight our way back through. And so, again, the theory being that America won't have the energy or willingness to fight our way back through, and Japan will be left to kind of keep the empire they've created. So the Japanese are really underestimating, I think, the American war fighting spirit. But of course, the way the Japanese go about this, in fact, increases that war spirit dramatically because it's a sneak attack. It's not one we were expecting. War had not been declared when they started dropping bombs on Pearl Harbor, which is right over here. So we see on this map, we've got the Japanese carriers, aircraft carriers sailing out. They would launch the planes from here against Oahu. They would land, and then the fleet would then sail back across the Pacific to Japan. This is going to kill over 2,000 Americans, sink several of our ships. Here's just a quick map here. You can see the first and second wave of Japanese planes. There's Pearl Harbor right in the middle. This is Pearl Harbor today. That's Ford Island. So imagine all of our battleships kind of lined up right through here. Other warships over here, as you see on this map. And they're sitting ducks. This was called Battleship Row. And there's Battleship Row, Ford Island, Japanese plane here during Pearl Harbor, and some images from the damage. The USS Arizona sunk famously, killing over 1,000 of their crew members on board, and USS Arizona is still there in Pearl Harbor today. If you ever get a chance to go to Oahu and see it, be quite a lot of history to see. They're a very somber place, though, because many of those sailors were never recovered. Their bodies are still there in the USS Arizona. Obviously, the response to Pearl Harbor back in America was one of anger, confusion, sadness, and a desire for revenge. We've got to do something to get back against the Japanese. And so Congress declares war against the Japanese. The very next day, there's FDR, talking about December 7th, a day which will live in infamy. And there he is, signing the declaration of war. Notice the R band, the black R band, for a sign of mourning. we declared war on Japan, and then Germany and Italy declared war on us. And so we, respond and declare war on them. So by December 11th, 1941, we're at war not with Japan, but Japan, Germany, and Italy all at the same time. And that is pretty much it for Chapter 34. So some key points to remember on our way to war. Think of the Neutrality Acts and how they at first reflect isolationism, but then reflect our shift to supplying weapons and goods to the countries we see as necessary for our self-defense. Think back to the failure of appeasement. This idea of giving in to aggressors as a way to maintain the peace actually backfires and allows the aggressor to gain strength and build up their reserves before we have a chance to really take them down. You need to also focus on the failures of the League of Nations and how they kind of endorsed appeasement. I would also focus back in on some key aspects of Hitler's aggression across Europe, the fall of France, the Battle of Britain, his invasion of the Soviet Union, all how they impact American foreign policy. And then, of course, obviously that brings us to Pearl Harbor. You've got to go, be familiar with the causes and effects. The Japanese felt that they had no choice but to attack us. We were trying to put pressure on them by limiting our supply of raw materials to Japan. And in the end, the Japanese, their underestimation of us, I think, is going to go back and haunt them later in the war. So again, that's just a quick review of Chapter 34, our road to war, and Chapter 35, which will be our final chapter in this Unit 7, Period 7. We will cover the war itself, and we'll look at not just the military campaigns, but also its impact on the civilian side of things as well.